There has been so much talk on corruption in Africa that it's almost like beating a dead horse. People have asked, how can a phenomenon so ingrained in everyday life be changed? In our next segment, where we profile the lives of people and their niche, you will meet Robtel Pailey, a Liberian academic and author who has written a book about corruption for children. An interesting dimension indeed. Enjoy. So, this is just incredible.
Thank you.
How did you come to this point?
Well, honestly, I became so frustrated with how the rhetoric around corruption, fighting corruption in Liberia, that I wrote the book Gbagba, which means trickery in my mother's native Bassa language, because I really wanted to start a national conversation with the children in the country about what it means to be honest, what it means to have integrity, and also what it means to be accountable to your community, but also your nation. I thought that would be important. You know, sometimes when we talk about corruption, and it's not just unique to Liberia, obviously, but when we talk about corruption, it's often about public sector graft. So what people in entrusted power in government are doing to steal from the national treasury, or people in the private sector are doing to get concession deals signed. But we don't really talk about how corruption manifests itself in the everyday human interaction amongst people in particular nations.
There's this thing parents usually do. I don't know if you're familiar with it in Liberia, but you know,
Probably.
a mother tells a child,
Yes.
like in my part of the world, in Nigeria, it's common for a mother to say, "Oh, there's a guest out there. Tell him I'm not at home," you know, and the child does that. But they're the little things, right?
Yeah.
The little things that adds up.
Sure. We adults don't realize it sometimes that we send very confusing ethical messages to children. We tell them the difference between right and wrong, but we in our own everyday actions perpetuate lies and theft. And we also often point the finger at the public sector or those in the private sector, and we say that they are engaged in corrupt practices. And until we start recognizing that government and the private sector in many ways is a reflection of society, and we ourselves are complicit in that corruption in the ways that we deal with one another, then I don't think corruption will be minimized. I'm not sure that it can be completely eradicated, but I figured that if we started talking to children about what those blurred lines are and how that there's almost a baseline of being truthful, and then use that as a springboard to talk about ethical practices in everyday life, then perhaps we could change things. And I'll give you an example. So I've done readings of the book Gbagba to a number of different schools in Monrovia, Liberia's capital. And I didn't just start reading the book, or I didn't explain to them what Gbagba meant. What I start off with is I ask them a very simple question. Have you heard of this word corruption? Do you know what it means? And I was surprised by the kinds of responses I got from children. And they gave me stories, so the personal anecdotes about what they believe corruption to be. And one young woman, it's a story that I tell quite often, one young girl, she was probably about 6 or 7, and she said, "Yes, I know what corruption is." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And she said, "You know, I have a nurse, what we call a nurse, someone who is responsible for taking care of her when her parents are at work. So the person takes her to school, picks her up, and stays with her while her parents are at work. And when they come back, then she's released." And the young girl said that apparently this woman who had been entrusted to take care of her had been taking her lunch money on multiple occasions. And she named that act corruption. And it very much aligns with the formal definition of corruption, even though it's not a public sector graft kind of case. But it's basically this woman who's using her entrusted power over this young girl for her own private gain. So she's been taking her money. And I asked her, I said, "Well, have you reported this to your mom and your dad?" She said, "No, because they're not going to do anything about it." This child understood that, number one, this woman had done something wrong, and number two, there wouldn't be any consequences. I'd like to read a passage from a section of the book in which the two characters, Sandeba and Sandega, encounter traffic. They're visiting their aunt in Monrovia from Buchanan, which is where they live. And the aunt essentially asks her driver to give the police officer some money to enable them to pass by the traffic. And their response is quite interesting. Sandema and Sandega were confused by what Opa did and disappointed in the policeman's unfairness to the drivers. In Buchanan, Ma and Pa always reminded them that they should not jump in front of others in line.
And here was the auntie.
Here was the auntie essentially completely discarding that.
Do you think this message cuts across the continent?
There's been sort of a normalization of corruption as something that's to be expected because there's poverty, quite frankly, but then there's also greed. So I often describe corruption as a continental challenge that's a function of both poverty and greed. And the reason I say that is because people who engage in corruption are not just wealthy public sector officials. People who engage in corruption are also quite poor, quite disillusioned with the system, and find mechanisms to bypass systems that ultimately don't benefit them.
You've been in the diaspora, but you've been home, you've worked in Liberia. Actually chaired a committee with the government on scholarships, trying to clean up the system and ensure it was based on merit. But you had a bittersweet experience, as I've seen from some of your works. How did that impact on you writing this book?
I saw two things. I saw a small group of people who were really committed to transformation and really committed to change and who worked exceedingly hard to make that happen. But I also saw some people who were committed to maintaining the status quo, unfortunately, and that often creates a clash of values and of course of policy making. In terms of corruption, without going into too much detail, I saw things that I perceived to be corruption that other people didn't perceive to be corruption. And the example that I often give is a personal example, sort of, that I encountered. When I moved to Liberia, one of the things I was really interested in was creating a system where we could have like a meritocracy. I realized after looking at a number of different newspaper articles that Liberia has a very long history of receiving scholarships from countries abroad on the continent of Africa as well as internationally outside of the continent. And through my own investigation, personal investigation, I found out that those scholarships were being given basically to the highest bidder or to relatives of government officials, many of whom had the wherewithal to send their children to school without scholarships. And so I approached the president about this, and I had a conversation with her, and I said, as someone who's been on scholarships, merit-based academic scholarships since I was 15 years old, I thought it was important to change that whole system, overhaul it, come up with a framework, so that those who are really deserving in the country could go abroad, gain the skills, and come back and work as our agriculturalists, work as our medical professionals, work as our engineers, work as our policymakers. And she said, okay, well, if this is a problem, come up with your framework, we'll put a small committee together and you can head the committee. And so we did. We came up with a framework and completely changed the whole system. So there were 3 or 4 young men who apparently had forged their national exam records to become eligible for this scholarship, because before there were no eligibility criteria. Anyone who had the money to buy their way through the system could. And so we called them in, my committee and I called them in and just had a conversation with them about the fact that we asked them, is there anything peculiar, different about your national exam records that you want to tell us? Kind of probing them so that they could actually tell the truth and tell us what would happen. And they denied it. They said they hadn't forged their exam records. And we said to them, but we actually have proof from WIEC that the exam records that you gave to us are not authentic. And then one of them finally admitted that he had forged it. But for me, this was so profound because I think I realized that these were 18-year-old boys on the verge of adulthood, about to go into college, who had, again, rationalized corruption as by any means necessary. Whatever you need to do to get ahead, you do it. And if that means forging your national exam records, then it's okay. And I think that encounter, for me, also inspired Gbagba, because I realized that we can't wait until someone is 18 or 17 in a system that doesn't necessarily value honesty, where, you know, if you are a public sector worker and you happen to leave office or there's regime change and you haven't amassed wealth, people will call you stupid. So there's almost an expectation that it's public sector is for chopping, it's for stealing, it's for taking as much as you can, forget the consequences, because there are none.
So where do you go from here? What next with Gbagba? What next for you?
I think long term, I'd like to see the book in other African countries. As I mentioned, I'd love to see Gbagba being taught in Nigerian schools. I'd love to see Gbagba being taught in South African schools, in Rwandan schools, in Egyptian schools, in Kenyan schools. Because it's not just a Liberian narrative. It's a universal narrative, it's a continental narrative that speaks to the experiences of Africans.
And before we go, here are some tips from our London diaries, some sights and sounds. Oxford Street and environs, the hub for fashion pilgrims. But you know that, of course, even as you nod in agreement. So here's something that might ease the tedious process of coming the area. Tedious being in quote. Now when you've walked the length and breadth, seeking out good bargains, and your weary feet is badly in need of some respite, make a detour and head into Duke Street, just off Oxford Street towards the Marble Arch end. Walk some 50 steps or a little more and you face Brown Heart Gardens, a quiet little garden where you can sit, go over your purchases, or map out how many more shops you need to peruse. Grab some coffee while debating with yourself or a friend on the pros and cons of returning a purchase or buying a second item, albeit in a different color. This is just to nudge you towards discovering London's little havens amidst the beehive. And that's all the dispatches we have to deliver to you today. We're so glad you could share your time with us. Join us again next time. See you soon and keep well.